So while looking through Rafa's talents to look for some interesting builds, I may have found one that allows you to stay in an action skill infinitely, gives you quite a lot of health regen over time, and has some absolutely absurd damage scaling. And not only that, but all of this wrapped up in the fact that this is going to be using the Arc Knife's action skill, which if you don't know, this is a full melee based action skill that takes you into a third person point of view. So if this build works how I think it's going to work, this is going to be a fully melee focused build where you're only using melee pretty much 100% of the time, and you get a third person point of view, which is going to be unique to Borderlands 4. So I want to go over the entirety of that build. So let's start off with Rafa's trait, which is Overdrive. When Rafa activates an action skill, he enters Overdrive. While an action skill is active, its duration does not decrease, and at baseline, it gives you a 10% increase to your damage and a 25% increase to your speed. If your action skill ends, it lasts for another 12 seconds, but this build is focused around never not being in an action skill, so this should always be active. Now our action skill is Arc Knives. Rafa puts down his guns and equips Arc Knives, blades that deal melee damage and mark enemies whenever they damage them, causing them to take increased damage for every mark on them. And this has multiple abilities. So first ability is perform melee attacks. That's kind of your base attack. Then dash forward and perform a shock melee attack. So you have a dash with a damage element to it. Then we have his kind of ultimate in this, which is unleash Rafa's Blade Fury, which deals shock damage to all marked enemies and ends a skill. Based upon what I'm reading in all these skills, we are never going to use Blade Fury. Maybe at like the end of a fight if you're going to be like jumping in a vehicle or something, but Blade Fury still ends Arc Knives even though we're supposed to infinitely be in it. So when in combat, you're basically never using that, which is kind of sad because it's a cool part of Arc Knives. You're never going to use it because you always want to stay in Arc Knives. So you're basically just in melee and you have a dash attack and a melee attack. We're just going to always be running around in third person and meleeing everything. Another really interesting part about this build is all of our 49 points are in one tree. They're in the green tree because we really don't have a bunch of other options at the top portions of either of the other trees. And what's also really interesting is it doesn't feel like we have wasted points. Because in a lot of other builds I've been looking at, it feels like there are some points that are kind of wasted to get to this other node to get lower in the tree. It doesn't really feel like that with this build. It feels like almost everything is really useful. But starting off, we have a handshake deal. Rafa gains increased gun damage and melee damage. And keep in mind, on this max roll build planner, it doesn't have the increase to the effects of these nodes. So the 7% increased melee damage is 1 point. Presumably, these are going to have linear scaling. So it will be an additional 7% melee with each point. So this is just quite a lot of melee damage. So next up we have Midnight Oil. Rafa's action skills deal bonus corrosive damage. The longer the skill has been active, the greater the bonus damage. At 1 point it's 2% per second. Presumably this goes up to 10% increase of bonus corrosive damage per second. And it doesn't say it has any caps. So this could be infinite scaling, but I'm presuming there's some internal cap to this where it won't go past. Either way, 10% per second, even if it caps at like 100% bonus damage, that's absurd because keep in mind, this isn't increased corrosive damage, this is bonus. So now every melee attack we deal or any bit of damage we deal in our action skill will deal its normal damage, whatever element that is. Then it'll deal an additional percentage of that as bonus corrosive. So it's extra. So you'll see your normal hit, then another green hit on top of that, which is going to be really important for some of the other effects. Then we can actually go into our augment, which is Dead Man Walking. Arc Knives does not end when its duration runs out. Instead, it only ends if Rafa ends Fight for Your Life, so if you get down, or activates Blade Fury, which is the third ability we talked about that we're never going to use. While Arc Knife's duration is depleted, Rafa loses health instead. Whenever Rafa damages an enemy, he gains Overshield. So Overshield is actually a new effect in Borderlands 4. It essentially is another shield that doesn't regain itself, and it has, I think, an 8-second duration normally, and I think you can get Overshield up to like 70 or 80% of your normal shielding. So it's kind of what you'd expect. There's just a little bit of specific information around that. I don't know if the Rafa loses health instead when the duration runs out is like a scaling damage. Based upon what it's saying just on the skill card, it sounds like it's just some flat health loss per second after the duration runs out, which based upon some of the other things we're putting in this build, this may just not affect you really, and you may actually be able to regen more health than this is actually losing. So essentially, if you don't die, don't use the third ability of your arc knives, you will just be infinitely in arc knives, which is crazy. And then for the final point of this top section, we have Dial In. Whenever Rafa damages an enemy with a melee attack, his melee attacks gain critical hit chance. This chance stacks, and all stacks are removed whenever Rafa critically hits an enemy. And this is 3% per stack, and I'm assuming this is either 3% per point put in this, which would be 15% per stack, which sounds more like it, or maybe if it's a little less strong, it'll be 3% in the first point and then 1% each other point. But I'm assuming this is 15% per stack. And then again, once you crit, the stacks reset. So you'll basically be hitting enemies, getting these stacks for more and more crit until you crit. Then it'll drop all of your crit and then you'll build them back up. But essentially, this is just adding a bunch of additional chances for your melees to crit, which will also synergize with some of our other points. But then we're going down for 5 points into the left box down here, which is Blowout. Whenever Rafa applies a heavy arms mark or critically hits an enemy with his action skill, they explode in corrosive lobbed projectiles. The longer Rafa's action skill has been active, the more corrosive projectiles are spawned. So there's a few elements to this. First off, the heavy arms mark just seems to be the mark from arc knives, because you can actually go to the official Borderlands 4 website and they have all of the talent nodes laid out specifically in text, and it just says when applies a mark in that. So it seems like it's just applying marks, which is basically meleeing people. So it seems like meleeing anything will spawn these lob projectiles. They do have a 1-second cooldown, which I don't think is going to change, so these can't like infinitely be spawned, but it also seems you're going to be spawning a lot of projectiles because you're going to be in this for so long. You're going to max out your projectiles. There is a max projectile count. I'm assuming that also increases with points, and then the projectile damage is also probably increased with how many points are in this. So essentially every 1 second when we melee something, because it's always going to apply a mark and we're going to crit a lot, we'll just be spawning a bunch of these corrosive projectiles that are probably just going to run around and deal damage to enemies, which is really cool. So we'll just be spewing out these corrosive projectiles everywhere. We'll probably be spawning a ridiculous amount of them as well, which will just look really cool as well, and probably deal a ton of damage. And then let's go to our middle section. We have 5 points into Collaborate Ignition. It's an overdrive skill, which again, overdrive will always be active for us. Rafa deals a bonus damage of his weapon's element with all skills and ordinances while overdrive is active. 1 point is 12% of weapons damage. I assume this is going to be increased with more and more points. So basically, whatever weapon is in your hand, you're going to be dealing bonus damage, which is an additional damage proc on top of your other damage of that weapon's element with both skills and ordinances. So let's say we're holding a cryo weapon. Our arc knives will now just be dealing some amount of a bonus damage as cryo damage, which is actually really cool. And if you're keeping track, let's say we melee something, it seems melee is just going to be base damage or non-elemental damage, but then we deal corrosive damage on top of that as bonus damage for Midnight Oil. Now we can deal whatever element we want as more bonus damage on top of that as well, because overdrive is always active. So this is just a ton of additional damage based upon the weapon. Now this may be tricky because I'm assuming just whatever weapon is in your hand when you use arc knives is probably what it's going to count off of. I'm assuming you can't switch weapons when in arc knives. There may actually be the possibility that whatever slot you were on when you went into arc knives, there is a possibility you can go into your inventory and switch a different weapon to that and actually switch what damage this would be dealing, but we're not exactly sure on that. And then we have 3 points into Synergia. Whenever Rafa deals ordnance damage, he also deals increased gun and melee damage. This affects stacks. So for melee, it's 4% per stack. I'm assuming this scales more and more, probably up to 12% per stack based upon this. It has a duration of 8 seconds, but it doesn't have a stack amount. It says, I'm presuming there is a stack count, but not exactly sure. And we'll go over how you'll be able to deal ordnance damage. The first way you can deal ordnance damage is 2 points into Booming Business. Whenever Rafa critically hits an enemy, his has a chance to spawn a free grenade, and this goes off of whatever grenade mod you have equipped. If you have one equipped, it says it's a 12-second cooldown with a 50% chance. I don't know what putting more points into this does. I don't know if it increases the percent chance or if it reduces the cooldown, presumably both, but this is just the first way, and more so this is to get lower into the tree. But the main way we deal ordnance damage is El Diablito. A portion of all fire damage Rafa deals also deals bonus fire ordnance damage, and the bonus damage is 10% of damage dealt, so it's probably going to be 50% of damage dealt. And you probably are realizing, how are we dealing fire damage? Well, that is our capstone. So our capstone is Inferno Protocol. While arc knives are active, Rafa's exosuit stores all damage dealt to him. The exosuit then heats up and constantly does a small amount of fire damage to him. So we're taking a small amount of fire damage constantly. Additionally, Rafa's melee attacks deal bonus fire damage, which is first off how we proc this passive to deal bonus fire ordnance damage. But then a portion of all damage dealt to Rafa is also dealt to enemies he has marked. Now it also does something based upon your blade flurry, which we're not actually going to be using much. And what's really interesting is we'll be taking damage based upon Dead Man Walking. When the duration is gone, we'll just be constantly losing health. Presumably this is going to be damage dealt to us that will keep proccing Inferno Protocol, which keeps us heated up, dealing a small amount of fire damage to us. Then we will be dealing just that bonus fire damage, which will be proccing this passive effect that will then deal more bonus fire damage just as ordnance damage that will then be stacking up this passive effect to give us more melee damage. So the synergy with these two passives and our capstone is kind of crazy with infinite arc knives. And then if the constant health loss of Dead Man Walking also keeps re-procking and dealing damage to marked enemies, that's also going to be really crazy as well. So there's just going to be this crazy synergy with a bunch of our passives here and our augment and capstone that I think is going to be crazy strong. And then finally, we have our right side tree, which has ridiculous scaling. First off, we have El Borracho, which Rafa deals increased corrosive damage while his action skill is active. The longer it has been active, the greater the bonus. Now, on the official Borderlands 4 website, it says that this effect stacks, and I'm assuming this is going to be 5% corrosive damage per second. It stacks up more and more the longer this effect has been active. But like some of the other skills, I'm assuming there is an internal stack limit to this, but even if that's the case, the damage increase that this is going to be crazy. And also keep in mind, all of the damage we're dealing with our action skills, we deal a bonus corrosive damage on top of that is increasing the longer our action skill is active. So this is going to be a ridiculous amount of bonus corrosive damage that's going to be scaled by this passive that again scales more and more with how long our action skill has been active. Then we also, from Blowout, are proccing all of these corrosive projectiles. They're going to be dealing a bunch of damage, and we get more projectiles the longer the action skill has been active. So we're going to be dealing a ton of bonus corrosive damage that is also going to be increased by this passive now. Our corrosive damage is going to be absurd on top of all of our other damage. And then we have 5 points into sustainable energy, which is an overdrive skill, which will just always be active. Rafa gains health regen based upon how much overdrive time is remaining. Now for 1 point, it's up to 0.8 max health per second. So presumably at max, this goes up to like 4% max health per second. It doesn't say how this actually works. It doesn't say if it's more duration is more health per second or if it's less duration. I'm assuming based upon how overdrive works that this scales up the less duration it has. So I'm assuming this will give us less health per second because it won't have a duration, but stacked up 5 times and being based upon a percentage of our max health will probably still give us some good amount of healing because it'll just be healing forever. So this should still be a good amount of healing. And then for our final 4 points, we have Cruel Accrual. Rafa gains increased skill damage with all skills. The longer his action skill has been active, the greater the bonus. So this is another thing that the longer the action skill has been active, the greater the bonus. This is 2% per second. Presumably this is going to be up to 8% per second with us having 4 points into this. And this will just be scaling all of our skill damage. Pretty much all of the damage we're dealing besides any of our ordnance damage will be skill damage, and I actually don't know if this bonus ordinance damage we're dealing would be scaled upon this as well, because it's based upon our arc knife. So I'm not 100% sure on how everything is going to scale, even things like our lobbed corrosive projectiles from Blowout. I'm not sure if those will scale off that, but this is again just crazy amounts of scaling based upon us being in our action skill for longer, and this build is focused around being in our action skill forever. So this again is just absurd damage scaling, and based upon how all of these different skills that just get scaled off of how long we're in our action skill are going to work, based upon what kind of internal stacks or limits they have, this build is potentially going to be dealing some absurd amounts of damage. And even though we can't really go into gearing yet because the game isn't out, there's actually one really interesting piece of gear that could work very well with this build. And this is the only legendary rep kit we've seen so far, which is the large pacemaker. And the legendary effect of this is pulsometer, passively gain health over time, increasing in rate when your health is low. And based upon some of the talents we just went over, we are already getting essentially infinite health regen over time. Not necessarily infinite, but it is always active. That's essentially what this legendary effect would also be doing, but this one just increases its rate when your health is low. So based upon how much health we have and different breakpoints of the healing of this mixed with the healing through our talents, we may just not be able to die based upon our draining health, because keep in mind we do have multiple things that are going to be draining our health in this build. We have the constant fire damage we're taking from our capstone, and we have the constant draining of our health through our augment, which is how we're infinitely staying in our action skill. So based upon how much those are actually draining, we're going to want to have some amount of healing that counteracts that. And I've been saying that the first character I want to play is Vex, but based upon this build, I'm kind of teetering on playing Rafa now, just because this build seems so incredibly cool and just really unique. Full melee builds in Borderlands games have always been kind of unique and out of the ordinary, even though we've had some, but this one is even more unique because arc knives is the first time that there's something in Borderlands that puts you into third person. You'll essentially be able to play the game in a different point of view. If you can stay in your action skill forever that's in third person, you just get to play the game in third person the whole time, which is actually a really cool effect to be able to have. And I'm very curious if developers actually want that to be the case, and that's why they made Dead Man Walking. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.